Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome to another one of our Reedsy Lives, coming here from the London studio. Thank you very much for joining us here today. I see a lot of you folks are already coming in. Thank you for letting us know where you're coming from. I'll get to you in just a second. We've got a special, well, they're all special, a special webinar for you today from one of our fantastic editors, Edmund Pickett. I'll let him sort of explain who he is, but as an editor, he came to our attention through Mark Dawson, who is one of the bigger names in the world of self-publishing. He's a writer of thrillers who's had a fantastic amount of acclaim and a lot of success as a self-published author. And I think I shall invite Edmund on.
Okay. Well, I've written 4 novels, a book of short stories, and some poems. You can find those on Amazon, or you can go to my website, edmundpickett.com. I've also been editing for about 4 years. I started off, my first editing job was with Mark Dawson. And then when Reedsy got started, Mark recommended me to them. And so I've been working for Reedsy for almost a couple of years. I've edited about 60 novels in that time. Most of them from first-time writers. It sounds to me like my voice is a little weird today. I'm getting over the flu, so I'm not really about ready to cry. It just sounds that way.
I think you were still sort of on the flu when I first met you, so I really don't know what you sound like, I suppose.
Okay, well, that's good.
Okay, well, having worked with so many first-time authors and edited so many thrillers, I imagine you'll be raring to share some of your wisdom there. So I'm going to let you go. I'll be keeping an eye on the comments. We're going to have a Q&A at the end. So hold most of the questions until then, so it's easier for me to find. But if there's anything relevant you guys at home want to ask Edmund during the talk, just let me know. I'll keep an eye on that. I might flag it up. Anyway, I'll catch you in about 20 minutes, Edmund.
Okay. Martin earlier asked me to begin my talk, at least, on the subject of backstory. And I don't think I can talk for 20 minutes on backstory, but I have a few things that I've noticed about it in all of those 60 novels that I've mentioned. Most of those were by beginning authors, and so I think I've seen most of the mistakes that new authors can make with backstory. At its simplest, backstory is a good thing. Every character in a novel will have some backstory. That just means whatever happened to them in their life up until the point when the novel begins. In the 18th and 19th centuries, backstory was usually given to the readers in the form of a big dump. When a new character was introduced, the author would then back up and tell you the entire life story of that character starting in primary school. This meant that for 3 or 4 pages, you were learning everything about this character, but the business of the novel, the plot, stopped dead. This nowadays is considered a very weak technique, and in fact, it's called a backstory dump. You can imagine a large truck backing up and dumping a couple of tons of something smelly right in the middle of your novel. It destroys the flow of your story. The more modern technique is to deliver just a little bit of backstory here and there as you're going through your novel, only when it's necessary. I'm not saying you shouldn't write full backstories on most of the characters in your novel. That's actually a good technique. But don't get confused and think all those backstory files you're writing on your characters should be part of the novel. They're not. If you want to write 10 or 20 pages about the previous history of half a dozen characters in your book, go ahead. That's useful because you become more and more familiar with those characters. In the process of doing that, you will begin to hear how those characters speak and how they act, and that is very useful. But once you've finished all those backstory documents, put them in a folder on your computer and don't look at them anymore. You'll only remember the good parts. You'll forget all the boring parts. And this ties in with a theory I've had for a long time that memory is the best editor. When you're revising your first draft to go into a second draft, I think you should read the first draft once through, then put it away. Go ahead and start your second draft without having that first draft sitting on the desk in front of you. When you look at the previous draft while writing a new draft, you save too much. You don't notice the clumsiness. You repeat it. Copy the clumsy sentences from one draft to the next. When you're revising and rewriting by memory, your mind automatically forgets the awkward sentences. And you just remember the good parts. If you can try this by yourself. Revise a couple of chapters in your head, then type them out or however you do it. Once you're done, do a word count on the first version and the second version. I think you'll discover that the second version is shorter and more vivid. This is the advantage of not looking at your backstory files after you've written them. That information and preparing all that was useful. It was a good thing to do, but don't dump all that into a file because your readers will get halfway through the life story of character X, and they'll suddenly realize that checking the text messages on their phone sounds like something more fun to do, or maybe they'll want to go to the kitchen and get a snack, and you just lost a reader. Excuse me, I got to get rid of that cough drop. Mark Dawson says that he wants to write unput-downable fiction, and that should be your goal also. Don't give your readers an excuse to put down their Kindle. A backstory dump is a real good way to make your readers think they've got something else more interesting to do. A few years ago, Mark Dawson had an anthology he was offering for 99 cents, which had, I think 13, it was called Thriller 13, and it contained 13 novellas. One of those was by Simon Wood, and it was called Low Lives. I checked with Mark yesterday, and that he doesn't have that book available anymore. But perhaps you can find somewhere, if you search, the story by Simon Wood, Low Lives. It has the best use of backstory that I remember seeing for a long, long time. It begins with a man who's passed out drunk on the side of a street in San Francisco. He wakes up only because someone is robbing him. He jumps up and announces that he's a police detective. This scares off the robber, and then the man realizes he doesn't even know where he left his car, which is kind of a big mistake for a policeman. He begins running to the next location he can think of, and that sets the tone for the entire book. He's on the move constantly because very soon he realizes someone's trying to frame him for murder. So he's on the run throughout the whole novella. And about every 2 or 3 pages, he drops a little hint. This book is told in the first person. Every 2 or 3 pages, he says something about his past. Never very much. It answers some of the questions you have, but provokes 3 or 4 more questions. You can't figure out who this guy is. You become invested in his story. You identify with him trying to clear his name of this murder rap. And yet, every time he says something, you realize he's a real scumbag. You don't like him, but you become interested in him. And one of the reasons this works is because he's being very sparing with the backstory. He only tells you one thing, leaves you wondering 2 or 3 more things, and then keeps on running. The plot never slows down. This is how backstory should work. You never tell the readers anything about the previous history of a character until they have to know it, until they would be hopelessly confused without that particular bit of information. Then you give it to them and try to make them even more curious about what else you haven't told them. Backstory done like this is a tease. You're teasing your readers, you're creating suspense, you're making them want to find out more. It's like the old show business axiom, always leave the audience wanting more. Don't keep telling jokes until they're tired of you. Don't sing one more song. Leave when they're still hungry for more. And that's the way you should look at backstory. That's about all I can say right now. But if you have questions, save them for the question and answer period afterwards, and I'll be happy to answer them. I've seen, I think, all the mistakes you can make with backstory. At the moment, I'm probably repressed the memory of some of them. But anyway, I would like to add other things that I have noticed. In those 60 novels that I have edited, most from beginners, I've noticed several recurring themes. I get these requests, which are usually 10, 12 pages long, and people tell me what kind of editing they want. There are three kinds of editing. There's proofreading, which is the simplest. That deals with spelling and punctuation. Then there's copy editing, which involves untangling complicated sentences or pronouns that don't have an antecedent, things like that. It's on the sentence level. And then there's developmental editing, which covers everything that takes place over the course of the entire novel. Developmental editing looks at the plot, the characters, and the flow of ideas through the book. I've had people request developmental editing on a fragment of a book, which shows me they don't really know what's going on with developmental editing. People send me a 10,000 word sample and want a developmental edit. But if I don't know how the book is going to end, how do I know if the parts are proportioned properly? This is the number one word that applies in developmental editing, and that is proportion. As a developmental editor, I have to point out if a minor character has too much space, if the author is wasting too many words on his hobby, or if there are dangling plot threads that never are resolved. These are difficult things for an author to spot. I recently edited a book which had 5 main characters. One of them probably had as many words devoted to him as to the other 4 put together. It was clear that the author identified strongly with this character. He lovingly described his entire history, paragraph here, paragraph there. By the end of the book, we knew that the author really loved this character. The problem was, this character doesn't do anything in the book. The other 4 characters carried the plot themselves. It involved crooked generals and smuggling and explosions and gang war, all kinds of things. These other 4 characters were actively involved in all of that. This 5th character that I'm talking about only delivered a letter from one place to another. That was his contribution to the book. I kept waiting for him to step up and do something significant. Now, the author didn't realize that his book was completely out of balance because one character, obviously the favorite, wasn't doing anything. So I told him, delete this character or give him an integral part in your plot. This is the kind of things that authors usually don't notice. That's what developmental editors are for. Aside from the fact that you can't do a developmental edit on a fragment, it's also a misconception among a lot of beginning writers that they don't need developing edits. And probably 50 of the books I've edited were by new authors. So we're talking about first novels. Maybe 20, maybe half of those people thought they didn't need developmental editing. They had finished their first novel. They were convinced that all it needed was a little touching up, a little bit of proofreading perhaps, or copy editing. And they didn't think they needed developmental editing. Well, they were all wrong. they had all the problems I've been talking about. Imbalanced characterizations, too much time devoted to the author's hobby. That's a real common one. Minor characters taking up too much space, as well as absurdities in the plot. So what I would say, just based this on the experience that I've had over almost 2 years in seeing a lot of novels, is if you think you don't need developmental editing, you're wrong. That's the first thing you should do. And then if your editor tells you, this is a great story, these are great characters, you've really got something here, but you may need to have it proofread also, well, then believe that editor. And then you're ready for proofreading and copy editing. Those are the last things you should do. And if you're a beginning author, go with the developmental edit first. And don't trust your family or friends. They won't tell you the truth. I've had 3 or 4 manuscripts that I had to tell the authors I didn't think they could be saved. And I've had some others that I delivered reports that I'm sure the authors found it painful to read. One man that I sent off a pretty tough report didn't comment right away. 10 days later, though, however, he sent me a message and said, when I got your report, I was almost suicidal. I felt I had been kicked in the solar plexus. I couldn't think about it for a week. Then I went back and read your report again. And I realized that I agreed with most of what you said and that I had suspected all those weaknesses. But I guess I was hoping no one would notice. After another couple of days, I showed your report to my wife, and she said, yeah, that's about right. And I said to her, wait a minute, why didn't you say that the first time you read it? And she said, because we're married. And that's a good example of why you can't trust your friends and family. They are your friends, and they won't tell you the truth. Okay, I see Martin on screen. It looks like we may be ready for questions.
Yeah, well, I just actually want to get in a few questions myself before we
Sure.
let the folks in. Yeah, I have sort of a few sort of questions in my mind about the thriller genre itself. In particular, what do you think it is that sort of draws fans to? What are people sort of expecting from a thriller that I suppose if the author neglects it, then they might not be sort of servicing, what the fans are demanding from the genre?
Okay, well, thrillers frequently overlap with mysteries, but mysteries are usually kind of bloodless. There's a lot of deduction and questioning of witnesses, but there's usually not an awful lot of bloodshed. In thrillers, you usually have, well, more explosions and car chases, and the main character is usually in jeopardy, in risking life and limb. That's one of the main differences. Nowadays, in thrillers, international affairs are prominent. There are plots and counterplots among major nations, terrorism, things like that. Those are common in thrillers nowadays.
So,
go ahead.
Sorry, I was also I was sort of wondering, is there a sort of because I think you mentioned before sort of some of the sort of typical heroes or characters you find in there, like you do sort of see a fair amount of sort of Jack Reacher, I guess, type figures, or the sort of ones you'd see, the Alex Cross ones. They're quite archetypal in a way. Do you feel like they've sort of evolved much in like the last sort of 20 years, or are they still very much that sort of macho mainstay?
Many of the lead characters in thrillers are like that. Occasionally, you'll have a lead character in a thriller who doesn't fit that mold, but in the course of a book, rises to the occasion and becomes an impressive thriller operative, so to speak. You don't have to have somebody who's 6'5" with special forces training to be the main character in a thriller. But you do have to have somebody who can act fast when the situation demands. Recently, I edited a book on the main character was constantly afraid that this beautiful woman he was involved with, who was a CIA agent, that she did love him or she didn't love him, and she was going to leave him and all of this. And he wasn't sure that he could do this or he could do that. And I had to tell him, this guy's got to man up and stop doubting himself and stop questioning his girlfriend. And he wrote a second version of it. I edited version 2. He did a really good job of taking away all of the dithering from his character and making it believable. The man starts out unsure of himself, but in every scene, he becomes more and more Jack Reacher-like, so to speak. And that's a good way to do it. It surprises the readers. They like to see that kind of growth. They imagine that they themselves, in a tough situation, could rise to the occasion.
So, like, if you're writing a series, like the Jack Reacher ones and the John Milton ones have gone on for quite a time, sort of, traditionally speaking, we're sort of told to, that our protagonist requires some sort of arc going through the book. But when I guess there are over like 20, 30 books, it must be quite tough for there to be, ongoing personal change through all of them.
Yeah. You can have an arc for 3 books, but I don't think you can really have an arc for 30 books. You can have changes. You can have major changes over the course of time. And even at the end of 20 books, you can have one character retire and another character step up to carry on the flag, so to speak. Another series of books I like are the Roman Mysteries by Lindsay Davis. I think she wrote about 19 books about a Roman detective. And then she retired him, and his stepdaughter took over, and now she's written about 7 books with her as the main character. And that worked very well for her. It was a good way to start a new arc. I think she knew that the old arc was about played out.
Yeah, I suppose. So in terms of like plotting, I suppose you talked about backstory and the backstory dump being like detrimental, especially in this genre. So, like, how important is it for a writer to really hit the ground running, from the very first chapter?
Well, I usually tell people you don't have to have blood and explosions in chapter 1, but you probably should in chapter 2 if you don't. It is important to start. You don't want to start at the beginning. I mean, as Aristotle pointed out, even Homer knew that. You don't start at the beginning. You start in the middle of the action. And then, of course, you have to jump back a little bit and explain how we got there and how this battle began. But it is important to realize that in thrillers, there has to be constant movement in the plot. It doesn't all have to be gunshots and knife fights, but you do have to have something significant happening pretty often. You don't want to lose your readers, and they expect to be on the edge of their seats fairly often.
Did you mention, Edmund, that you have one last tip for folks?
Yeah, I do have a tip. This is a very valuable tip. I normally only give this to my highest paying clients, but today I'm feeling generous. I'm going to give it to everybody. And here it is. Revolvers don't have safeties. So now you know. Semi-automatics usually have safeties, but revolvers don't. So you wouldn't believe how many times I've run across that mistake.
Yeah, and no one should be playing Russian roulette with automatic pistols either. But thank you again, Edmund. Hope you're having a great day. Thanks, everyone, for joining us. And I'll see you next time for another writing webinar. Catch you later.